Hello everyone. This video is going to begin our review and supplement for Module 4B, which talks about the scientific study of judgment, decision making, and reasoning. And in this particular video, we are going to be talking about something called the availability heuristic. All right, so as I said, our next topic is actually going to include three different cognitive processes that are all somewhat related, right? So we have judgment, reasoning, and decision making, right? So I'm going to give one example for you guys that kind of nicely illustrates all three of these processes. So I'm sure all of us remember being in elementary school on the playground or maybe in PE class and playing dodgeball with our classmates. And one of the most challenging aspects of dodgeball is inevitably when you are split into teams, right? And you have those team captains who are responsible for choosing which kids they want to be on their team. Right? So let's put ourselves in the position of a kid playing dodgeball who's deciding which of his friends he wants to put on his team, right? Or have on his dodgeball team. So you might imagine the first thing that happens is he sort of looks around at all of the kids and he makes a judgment, right? And this judgment is most likely going to be on the basis of outward appearance, right? So for example, he might look at a kid and maybe he looks kind of out of shape, right? He looks out of shape or not as physically fit as the other kids, right? So that child is going to make the judgment or make the determination that that child is out of shape based on his physical characteristics, right? And on the basis of that judgment that that child is out of shape, he's going to draw conclusions, right? So he's going to draw the specific conclusion that because that child is out of shape, that in the past, children that were similarly not so physically fit haven't done well in the game of dodgeball, right? So we have a judgment deeming someone as not physically fit or out of shape, and we have reasoning that individuals who are out of shape don't do well in dodgeball, right? So that's an example of reaching a particular conclusion based on evidence or based on prior evidence. Lastly, we have decision making, and that's the easiest to understand. Decision making is just choosing between multiple alternatives. So choosing, do I pick this kid or do I not pick this kid, right? So because he's judged to be out of shape, the team captain reasons based on prior experience or evidence that kids who are out of shape can't play dodgeball, and therefore he reaches the decision that he's going to pass and not pick that particular child. Okay, so a lot of our decisions are, like I said, based on reasoning or based on conclusions that we draw from prior experience. Right? So I'll give another example. Many of you are working right now to register for classes, right? And as you are deciding whether or not to register for a particular class, your judgments that underlie that decision are often going to be based on if you've had a class in that particular department before, or if you have had that particular professor before, right? So if you've taken 5 classes with that particular professor and you find them to be very animated, very friendly, and their material very easy, or you've gotten an A in their classes before, based on that evidence, reasoning from that evidence, you might decide to take their class again. One more example, right? We are all ordering a lot of online food delivery nowadays. So if you have a favorite restaurant, maybe on DoorDash or Grubhub or wherever, and every time you order it, the food comes exactly when they say it's going to come, and it's always hot, and it has, you know, everything you need, your utensils and your straw and whatnot, and plenty of napkins, right? Then you would reason based on those prior experiences that if you were to decide to order again, the same thing would happen and that you would have a positive dining experience, right? So all of these examples illustrate the relationship between judgment, decision making, and reasoning. Right? So again, a heuristic is basically a mental shortcut that is meant to ease the burden that we place on our cognitive architecture, so to speak. Right? So just like we have absent-mindedness and transience and other sorts of sins of memory to cut down on the amount of irrelevant information that we're forced to process, right? Heuristics are going to allow us to reach fast conclusions, usually based on our prior experience, without having to do a lot of extra processing. Okay, so they're going to require fewer cognitive resources, and more often than not, they're going to lead us to the correct answer, or they're going to lead us to an appropriate decision. However, because heuristics operate by ignoring a lot of redundant or unnecessary information, right? Sometimes they can result in errors or biased conclusions, right? Because usually we're ignoring information that we don't need, but sometimes that information can actually be valuable. And if we neglect to notice or incorporate that information in our decisions, then we can be led to the wrong conclusion or a bad decision, so to speak. Okay, so we've already defined what judgment, reasoning, and decision making are. So for the remainder of the lecture, we're just going to discuss various examples of mental shortcuts that can bias our decision making or lead us to incorrect conclusions. Okay? So hopefully by this point, you guys have all done the worksheet that I linked on Canvas, or the activity that I linked on Canvas. So this will not be collected for a grade, but if you go through and answer all of the questions there, it's going to make it a lot easier for you to understand the rest of the lecture. Okay, so if you haven't already, go ahead and pull up that activity on Canvas and make sure you work all the way through all of the problems and then come back and listen to the rest of the lecture, right? Because each of those problems are going to correspond to a particular phenomenon that we talk about today, okay? Okay, so the first question I ask you on the activity is I ask you which words are more prevalent or more common? Words that begin with R or words in which R is the third letter? Okay. Well, this is the same question that Tversky and Kahneman asked their research participants in 1973. And when they asked them, 70% of people said that there are more words in the English language that start with R than words for which R is the third letter. Right? And one of the reasons why people were more likely to choose words that start with R is because it was easier to think of words that start with R, like rain, run, real, than it is to think of words with R in the third position. So words like word and car, right? So words that start with R come to mind a lot more easily than words where R is the third letter, right? But it turns out there are many, 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 many more words with R in the third letter than there are that starts with R. So in this case, it's an example of an incorrect conclusion, right? But this is one of the most common mental shortcuts or heuristics that people use that again leads them to the incorrect decision, right? So this is called the availability heuristic, the idea that events that are more easily remembered are judged as more probable or more likely than events less easily remembered, right? So again, it's the idea that anything that is more readily available or anything that comes to mind easier is going to be judged more likely than something that doesn't come to mind as easily. Okay? Okay. So, this is the second question that I asked you guys to answer on your worksheet, right? So it says some possible causes of death are listed below in pairs. Within each pair, which cause of death do you consider to be more likely for people in the United States? That is, if you randomly picked someone in the United States, would that person be more likely to die next year from cause A or cause B? Okay, so I wanted you guys to choose between each pair, cause A or cause B. Okay, so as it happened, researchers actually posed this same question to participants in an experiment in 1978, right? So in this slide, I have a table showing their results, okay? So let's break down this table together. So this table shows the results of, like I said, experiments in which people were asked to judge the relative prevalence of various causes of death. Okay? So for each pair of causes, the more likely cause is going to be listed on the left column. Okay? So the more likely cause is listed on the left column. The number in parentheses is going to indicate the relative frequency of the most likely cause as compared to the least likely cause or the less likely cause, right? And the number on the right is going to indicate the percentage of participants that chose the less likely cause. Okay, so let's look at an example together. So on the first pair, you're 20 times more likely to die from homicide than you are to die of an appendicitis. Okay, and in this particular example, only 9% of people chose the less likely cause. So 91% of participants correctly said that you were more likely to die of homicide than you were to die of an appendicitis, right? But quickly, if we look at some of the other pairs in the table, it becomes apparent that people are fairly bad at this task. So they're fairly bad at judging correctly the relative proportion of deaths or the more likely cause. So for example, one of the most striking examples is you're 920 times more likely to die from asthma than from botulism, right? but 41% of people assumed that botulism was the more likely cause. And similarly, 58% of people assumed you're more likely to die from a tornado than you are to die of asthma, but in reality, you're 20 times more likely to die from asthma than you are from dying in a tornado, right? So what's happening here? Why are people so bad at this task? Well, you might notice that many of the deaths that participants are assuming are more likely are things like tornadoes, botulism, an auto train collision, right? So all of those things are things that would very likely be front page news, right? So anybody who dies in a tornado or of botulism or in any kind of motor vehicle accident, right? That's probably going to show up on the news, right? So what that means is that we can think quite easily of examples of people dying in tornadoes, right? Because we've been sort of inundated with that in the news media, right? And again, because of the availability heuristic, one of our mental shortcuts is that whatever comes to mind most easily, we're going to deem more likely, right? So it's easy to think of people who have died in tornadoes or died in a tornado or what have you. And certainly people who have died of homicide, right? Because that is featured prominently in the news. So people are led to believe that those causes happen, or those deaths happen more often than they do in reality. Okay, so let's look at some other examples of the availability heuristic. So we looked at, for example, estimates of the likelihood of causes of death and also the relative prevalence of various words and so forth. But the availability heuristic also comes into play when we evaluate ourselves or we evaluate other people based on personality characteristics, for example. So in this particular study, participants were asked to answer the question, how often have you been assertive? Right? So in one condition, they were asked to generate 6 examples, and in another condition, they were asked to generate 12. And then after generating their specific examples of instances where they've been assertive, they were asked to rate their own degree of assertiveness on a 5-point scale. And what the researchers found is that people who only came up with 6 examples of being assertive actually rated themselves higher on the assertiveness scale than individuals who came up with 12 examples, right? Which doesn't really make sense, right? It seems like having to come up with 12 examples of all these instances where you've been assertive would lead you to the conclusion that you're more assertive than somebody who only had to come up with 6 examples. But what's happening here is it's easier to think of 6 examples of pretty much anything than it is to come up with 12 examples. And so because people in the 12 example condition kind of struggled and really had to think hard about prior instances of assertiveness, right? That led them to believe I must not be very assertive, right? Because these instances of assertiveness aren't coming to mind very easily, right? So this is another example of how the ease with which information comes to mind determines our subsequent judgments of something. Okay, one more example. So in this particular study, participants, which were actually students in a course were asked to come up with either 2 ways the course could be improved or 10 ways, okay, the course could be improved, okay? And then they were asked for an overall rating of the class. And again, people who had to come up with 10 ways the course could be improved actually gave higher ratings of the class than individuals who had come up with only 2 ways, right? Again, because they had a hard time, right? It was difficult to come up with 10 potential improvements for the course. And so that led them to the conclusion, I'm having a really hard time coming up with proposed improvements for this class. It must be a really good class, right? So again, the ease with which we're able to generate examples for something is going to determine our subsequent judgments about it.